Welcome to Renewable Watch Podcast, your front row seat towards really shaping India's renewable energy industry. I am Mohammad Ali Siddiqui and I'm joined by my co-host Sarthak Thakyar. In this episode, we break down the trends in the industry, why they matter, and where things might be headed. The stakes are high, the timeline is tight, and the questions are getting sharper. Our guest today is the CEO of Hero Future Energies, which is a name that is at the forefront of India's renewable energy transition. We're very pleased to have you with us on the podcast, Dr. Iyer.
Thank you. Thank you
So,
for having me.
yeah. So we could start off by our first question, which is how would you say that Hero Futures Energies has diversified its business operations over the past few years? And how do you cater to the evolving demands of the sector?
Uh, I'd like to go back to the beginning, right? Hero Future Energies is now 13 years old. When we started in wind. A couple of years later, we started a solar business as well. And in 2017, I believe we were India's first renewable energy company to do a solar wind hybrid. Because at that time, we realized that due to the intermittent nature and the time dependence of solar and wind, putting it together actually would give you power more hours of the day. Um, Around 22 onwards, I think we were one of the few companies in India that participated in a lot of what I call these complex bids, which are integration of solar, wind, and battery. And so that's what we really see at HFE is a constant evolution in terms of technology, where we keep adding new technologies to make sure that we meet the demands of the market. Also, about a year back, we started our first green hydrogen plant, and I believe it's still one of its kind, potentially even in the world, where we can blend green hydrogen with either LPG or with natural gas, and this is at an industrial customer site. And along the way, we also expanded our geographical presence. We have an operational 50 megawatt solar plant in Ukraine. We have almost 15 megawatts operational in Vietnam, and we continue to grow there. And we are going to break ground on our first project in the UK sometime this year. So we believe in diversification, both in terms of technologies, business models, and geographies. And that's how we continued our growth. The critical part, though, for all this is we constantly look for, I'd say, new opportunities in adding new types of technologies. Because the biggest challenge with renewables, as everybody knows, is intermittency. How do you make renewable energy dispatchable is something that we spend a lot of time on. And so that's kind of, I'd say, the next vector of growth for us.
Right. So, because you've mentioned that that you have been diversifying into many segments, my question is that how do you decide on which technology to diversify into, and what are the internal metrics that drive this decision-making process?
So I'd say from an internal metrics, the most important thing is a realization or an expectation that that technology is going to be impactful going forward, right? And is going to add value to the market and therefore value to the company.
Yeah.
So back in 2017, we did wind solar hybrid when that concept was not in the market, right? Today, a wind solar hybrid is what I call plain vanilla, right? It's very commonplace. I'd say there's dozens of projects that do that. But we did it early on to say, can we learn? Because we firmly believe that is the way the market is moving. And the same with battery storage. In fact, I'd say we were one of the early ones to win a standalone battery storage bid in India for Kerala Discom. Unfortunately, the tender got cancelled. But even back then, we realized that standalone battery and integrating battery with solar and wind was going to play a critical role. And so we invested time, effort, money, because we believe that's the way the market would move. And so by the time it moved there, we would already be ready. And the same thing with green hydrogen. I think we have the expectation and belief that green hydrogen will play an important role in decarbonization, especially hard to abate sectors. And so the earlier we do it and we learn, the better position we will be when the market actually takes off.
Okay. So, how do you think do tariffs and cost economics for hybrid and RTC and FDRE projects have evolved over the past few years?
So I think if you just look at the history of the tenders over the last 2 years, you've seen tariffs drop. right, consistently, for I'd say a couple of reasons. One is the cost of battery storage has actually significantly declined over the last 24 months. And also, all of us are getting better at coming up with the optimal configuration of solar, wind, and battery to still provide the same kind of, I'd say, power over every hourly segment if required to the market. And so it's a combination of both better optimization as well as very significant cost reduction in battery storage. And you're seeing that now reflected in lower tariffs.
Hmm. So what component do you think has contributed the most in terms of battery storage? What component would you say has contributed the most to the dramatic reduction in prices?
So a lot of it has to do with technology improvement. Now, lithium-ion batteries for stationary storage for utility is still fairly a young industry, right? And so two things have contributed. One is technology improvement that is happening literally every 6 months. And second is larger scale operations. So if you go to China and see, there's literally dozens of companies that have multi-gigawatt scale factories for battery storage, right? And so the competitive dynamics as well as technology improvement have pushed costs down, and the entire world is starting to see that.
Yeah. Okay. So do you think that FDRE obligations have created hidden balancing costs that perhaps the tariffs would not reveal in terms of who would bear the risk, developers or the discom?
So I think if you go back again, the wind sector in India is decades old.
Yeah.
Solar, probably let's call it 15 years, right? And a lot of transmission infra has been built in India over the last couple of decades to manage the growth of renewables. The biggest challenge, though, has been the greater the fraction of intermittent supply in the grid, the greater the strain on the grid. And the fact that you have more renewables also means that you're not utilizing the grid 24 hours a day.
Yeah.
So it's an investment that's only utilized, let's call it 30 or 40% of the time.
Mm.
If we ever have to look at decarbonizing the electricity grid in any country or around the world, we have to look at making renewables truly dispatchable. And so reliability is really absolutely critical. And so not having FDRE type or peak power or round the clock type tenders actually places additional cost on the grid because of grid instability. So these types of projects actually are going to benefit because if you were to look at transmission line investment and you spread it over greater number of units, the transmission cost per unit goes down. And second is you no longer have as much stress on the grid because you've got only intermittent supply on the grid. And thirdly, I think what we are seeing increasingly now in India is standalone battery projects coming up that sooner or later, I think there's going to be the concept of providing ancillary services to the grid as well in terms of inertia, voltage and frequency regulation. And when that happens, batteries will play a very important role in also maintaining grid stability, other than just, being a form of energy storage and releasing it in peak hours, right? So I think that's the way the country is moving, and it's absolutely, I think, important for us to move in that direction.
Mr. Iyer, let me chip in. And you talked about tariffs falling for round-the-clock renewables and the technology also maturing. A lot of projects are also coming up. So, what is the perspective of the lenders? Do they perceive these projects? Do they still find these projects risky, or have their perception towards RTC projects changed over the years? What is your experience when you talk to lenders?
I think lenders are getting more and more comfortable. Now, clearly, all of the projects that the industry has, the sector has, are being project financed. And lenders are also getting to terms with understanding how this technology works and how do you optimally design solar, wind, and battery in the right proportion so as to meet the tender requirements, because most of them have hourly compliance requirements, but at the same time provide a return to the investor. So I think lenders are quite comfortable. And again, they see the same trend that everybody else is, which is this is probably the wave of the future going forward. This will become the new normal.
And are lenders concerned about the growing number of projects for which the power purchase agreements have not been signed? And in your boardroom meetings, how much is the concern regarding this? And do you think this uh, issue of unsigned PPAs, will it grow for RTC projects or will it be more for standalone renewable projects? Or there's no correlation between?
Yeah, it's hard to tell right now because I guess we don't have a detailed listing, but I suspect a lot of the 45 gigawatts or so that's unsigned is plain vanilla, right? Plain
Yes.
vanilla solar or plain vanilla wind. And so I think the complex projects PPAs are getting signed. It's the plain vanilla ones that I think are having a little more, I'd say, waiting time. Now, I think this is not the first time India has been through this. I remember when I started 5 years back, I think 3 years back, there was the same concern. PPAs are not getting signed, right? So I think it's cyclical. What did happen clearly was I think there was a big push over the last 2 years to get a lot of these types of tenders. Uh, Typically, the REIAs used to bid out 10 to 20 gigawatts worth of tenders a year, and that suddenly went to 40 to 50, right? So the system also has to catch up. And I think it's just taking a little bit of time.
Also, in the RTC space, there used to be a good discussion on whether to set up co-located projects or non-co-located projects. So, what has been Hero Future Energy's strategy in this space, and which particular states do you look at for setting up round-the-clock projects?
There's pros and cons for both, for co-locating and not. The benefit of co-locating is you can share some of the infra, and especially on the common infrastructure that you have in terms of substations and so on. However, what really drives the economics is to make sure that you get good wind resource and solar resource in a common area, because the generation really trumps the additional cost you may bear if you were to not co-locate, right? And so finding regions in the country where you can have a good wind resource and good solar resource, really that's the key to this for co-locating. And if you don't, there's specific areas in the country that are very good for wind, and specific areas that are very good for solar, and so you could still site each one differently.
And apart from battery storage, you talked about standalone battery storage projects. So, what about pumps storage projects? Have you been thinking about that as well?
We have not, but as I guess you can read in the media, there's a lot of activity in India on pumped hydro storage, both from the private sector as well as the public sector. So when we look at, and I mentioned this earlier, is the ultimate goal is to make renewable energy perfectly dispatchable, right? And not be dependent on season. Now we all know wind has seasonalities. There's a high wind and a low wind. One has to be able to provide power every hour for 365 days of the year. And so all types of storage are going to play an important role. The advantage of pumped hydro storage is it is long duration. It can be 8 hours, 12 hours, 16 hours, 24 hours, right? Battery storage right now is somewhere, the max is somewhere in the 6 to 8 hours, right? Given the technology we have today. So pumped hydro certainly is going to play an important role. We at HFE are not looking into it, but I'm glad that there's a lot of activity in the country around that. One has to understand that those are large, large, large civil engineering projects, long gestation periods from conception to completion. So those are typically, I'm going to call them 6 to 10 year type projects, whereas traditional renewable energy are 2 year projects. But I think it is an all of the above solution that India needs. So it's good that pumped hydro is coming up.
Also, when we used to talk to several developers who used to bid for these FDRE, RTC hybrid projects, and one common concern for all of the developers was about the complexity of these tenders, how difficult it is to meet the exact criteria of these tenders. So what has been your experience with the tenders that have come up, and which are the specific areas where you think these tenders can be simplified?
I guess the tenders themselves are not complicated. meeting the tender requirements require fairly complex technology optimization, right? The tender structure itself is fairly, I'd say, typical, right? The challenge is to say if there is an hourly compliance requirement or a 15-minute compliance requirement, depending on the tender, can you effectively understand and model what solar generation is going to look like every hour for the full year, and wind generation is going to look like every hour for the full year, right? Based on historic data. And then using that, how do you figure out for the next 25 years, what do you think that's going to look like? And then design the appropriate amount of solar, wind, and battery to put it together at the lowest cost. And so give the lowest tariff to the consumer. That is a mathematical optimization problem. And so the complexity is there. It's not in the tender. I think the tender is fairly straightforward. But how do you put this optimization together is really where the challenge is.
Also, like you talked about the challenges that probably the designing team, construction team must be facing in the beginning. But for these kind of RTC projects, I'm sure the forecasting, scheduling team, the O&M team, who must be doing the forecasting and scheduling, they must be having a hard time too, and to meet uh, the exact DSM regulation, forecasting regulation, and there's heavy penalties attached as well. And especially during uh, monsoon period, it's, the deviations can vary a lot and leads to high penalties. So what has been your experience at Hero Future Energies, and what are the suggestions that you must be getting from the O&M team on how to reduce penalties, DSM penalties?
So we actually build that into our modeling as well, because there's two types of penalties. There's compliance penalties if you don't meet compliance in a particular hourly slot, and there's DSM penalties, right? So those are two separate, I'd say, constraints that one has to build in the optimization. Clearly, this is a learning for all of us. Now we all know that the DSM limits have gotten narrower and narrower. Right now, we're on version 3 where it's quite stringent already. I think the part of the benefit of having a wind, solar, battery integrated is you can try to minimize some of the DSM penalties because you have stored energy, right? So you'll be able to either store it in your system or release it to minimize either the hourly compliance or the DSM requirements, right? And so having these three together actually helps. It doesn't hurt because the accuracy of forecasting is more or less going to be the same as it was for a pure solar or pure wind. In other words, our degree of accuracy is not necessarily, sophistication has not improved, right? You still deal with the same variability. However, having multiple technologies, including storage, and the ability to occasionally sell on the market exchange helps us manage this, right? And so that's the optimization. That's really the additional optimization that the team has carried out.
And what about your standalone solar projects or wind projects, and in which, because we've talked to several developers, and even though they want to add the storage component to reduce their DSM penalties, they're not able to. So how do you manage the DSM penalties for those standalone solar project or wind project where you're not able to add a storage component? Like what other strategies
Yeah.
can be used?
So a couple of things, right? Right now, adding storage to uh, deal with DSM penalties is still not economically viable, right? At some point, we hope that storage costs drop even further, and then we could all look into adding small amounts of storage. Again, not necessarily to take advantage of peak off peak, but just to manage DSM penalties. And I'm sure every company will look into it at that point of time. Till that point of time, all we have to do is to try to improve our forecasting and scheduling as much as we can, and we deal with the variability.
And probably my last question, and then Ali can take it forward. So when you are planning about the RTC projects, so are you thinking about CNI customers as well? Because their demands are also changing and they're also demanding round the clock renewables and diverse set of tools, be it some round the clock renewables, some rooftop solar, some open access, and maybe getting some power from the exchange market. So, what is your strategy for the CNI market?
So absolutely, you're right. There's two reasons for the CNI sector today looking into renewable energy. One is its lower cost than typically getting it from the grid, and the second is most of them have commitments for net zero. And typically, the way they've been doing it the last 10 years is build me a solar and I'll get it for 8 hours, and then few years back they said build me a wind solar hybrid so I at least get 16 hours. Now there is definitely a push from them to say give it to me for 24 hours. The nuance here is every state is unique and we have to look at every state individually because of the banking regulations that are unique in every state. Some states allow banking from peak to off peak, in which case you don't need a wind solar battery. You can overbuild, just wind or can overbuild just solar and a little bit of wind. Some have banking regulations, but you can only do in like to like slots, right? So only off peak to off peak. And so as it's a state dependent solution and also dependent on, what the current draw of each consumer in the state is. A lot of the large consumers in the country have captive power plants already. So you have to be able to look at the requirements from the captive or the supply from the captive power plant, what is the balance, and then given the banking regulations, what combination of wind, solar, battery can you put for them? So absolutely, I think it's an emerging area and it'll certainly grow in importance going forward.
It's interesting that you talked about energy banking because energy banking has come up in several podcasts that we have done. So we in a podcast that we did with a developer. So obviously, banking is necessary and it has helped them in their operations. But in one of the podcasts that we did, a important uh, point was raised about the possibility of greenwashing because of banking, because developers may park their energy during a time when the renewables in the maybe in the afternoon period when the grid is reliant on renewables, but probably draw it back at night when the grid is dependent on thermal power. So don't you think there's a risk of greenwashing, and how do we correct that?
I think greenwashing is something that one hears of, certainly in the market. The other is, if you look at it from the discount perspective, because we always look at it from the consumer perspective. If they get excess power during the day, they don't necessarily need it, right? If you overbuild solar, for example, and then if they need to supply it back during peak hours because you've banked it, then they have to draw it typically from thermal sources, right? And so that is something that every state is looking at, and the banking regulations are still evolving. And if they go to a stage where every state kind of says, look, you can only bank in like for like hours, right? If I bank in the day, I can only pull during the day. Then a combined wind, solar, battery solution suddenly becomes far more important, right? And then there's not the concept of greenwashing anymore because you're literally, it's almost like you're providing RE compliance to the corporate sector, right? Every hour they require a certain amount of RE and you have to provide it. And it'll become more like the tenders that we see on the utility side, and the corporate CNI sector could go the same direction.
Uh, do you think that transmission delays currently are the single biggest non-financial risk or the challenge that the sector is facing right now? And what suggestions would you have in order to improve the CFA for the Green Energy Corridor 3?
I've got a mixed view on this. I think this is something that's commonly mentioned is transmission delays. One has to understand that transmission projects to evacuate renewable power are massive projects, right? They're huge in terms of investment, in terms of scale and scope, because those lines have to run hundreds of kilometers. Uh, and the fact that a lot of transmission infrastructure that's already been built is not being utilized 24 hours, right? So while I sympathize with the point of view that transmission infra is not keeping pace, one has to understand that the timeline of transmission infra gestation period is much larger than renewables. You can start putting renewable projects every 24 months. Transmission projects, by very definition, take longer time, right? So we have to understand that there's a timing mismatch, not a structural mismatch. The second is, and we are starting to see this more and more, at least the conversation is, how do you maximize the utilization of the existing infra? Right? So, for example, can you get nighttime connectivity on the same infra that already exists, right? And so you evacuate only at night. And I think these are the types of solutions that are coming up. And as always, I think the answer is all of the above. Do we need more transmission infra? Yes. Do we need to maximize the utilization of the existing transmission infra? Absolutely, right? And I think that's what is happening. So I see all of this as only a positive. I don't see this as a negative. We just need to understand that these are different projects with different timelines.
Yeah. I know we've spoken about RTC already, but I had a question on it. Which states would you say have shown the greatest of appetites in terms of RTC uptake in India?
You mean say in terms of sourcing the power, or in terms of
Yeah,
building projects?
building projects as well. Both actually.
It's for RTC, you cannot get away from wind, right? So you have to build wind. And so it's very easy to say which are the wind resource rich states in India, right? Clearly, you do Gujarat, Maharashtra, Karnataka, Andhra, right? It's a standard set of states. The other states have good solar resource, but not as good wind resource. And so it's not surprising that when you look at these types of projects, they're primarily getting built across these, what I call 5 or 6 states that have good wind resource, because that's the only way to meet the tender requirements is to build wind.
You've recently signed the 300 billion rupee MOU with the government of Andhra Pradesh. Would you please talk about that as well?
We're building multiple projects in Andhra. We're also evaluating additional, opportunities in Andhra. Andhra is one of the states that has good wind resource.
Yep.
And so if you were to look at that, you say, okay, future FDRE or peak power or RTC projects, if you need wind, you're going to have to build it in a state that has good wind resource. And I think we're quite comfortable both with, the availability of wind there, as well as I'd say the planning that CTU has to build additional substation and evacuation capacity. And I think that's really driven us to look at Andhra as, a location to build projects.
So, we also like to cater a certain segment of our podcast to some of the young professionals who are joining the renewable energy space. And on that note, we would like to ask you, do you have any advice to young professionals who would be joining the space, and some of the perhaps lessons that you have taken from your tremendous journey as well?
Advice, no. I'm more than happy to share my perspectives.
Yeah.
Energy has always been considered a mature sector, right? At least if you look at oil and gas, for example, right? It was never considered for two reasons. It was always considered a boring sector, and then became, quote unquote, a dirty sector, right? Because of the greenhouse gas emission and so on. Renewable energy is not a mature sector. It is still growing rapidly in terms of what can be done with it. So I'm not talking just growing in terms of size and scale, but it's also growing in terms of what the technology is, what the innovation is, what can be possible next, what are the offshoots from renewable energy, for example, green hydrogen. And then you can take one further adjacent step and say green hydrogen converted to other derivatives, right? Which become liquid fuels, for example. So there's a lot to explore, there's a lot to innovate, there's a lot to grow. And we're at very early stages in that evolution. So I actually look at this for anybody who's looking to construct a career as this is an exciting space to be in. right? Because you're joining it at a phase where a lot still hasn't been done. So it's as good a time as any to join this for the younger folks out there. Don't look at this as a boring sector. This is actually quite exciting because there's a lot of innovation, a lot of growth still left here.
Mr. Iyer, talking about innovation and growth, coming back to rounded clock renewables, any particular innovation that in the RTC space, FDRE space that we have not experimented in India, but you do hope that such kind of projects do come up? Any innovative project that nobody's talking about right now, but should be in the coming years?
So I don't know if we've necessarily thought that far ahead yet, primarily because we are still grappling with how do we design different technologies to meet the requirements, right, at the lowest possible cost. But I think the biggest innovation here is going to come in terms of are there brand new storage technologies we've not thought of that still haven't hit the market that can fundamentally change how we build these projects, right? Today, 2 years back, we said a 2 hour battery, is all that's available, and therefore you can do so much with it. Today, you can do a 6 hour battery, right? 2 years from now, probably you can get 12 or 18 hour batteries, maybe on new chemistries. Who knows, right? That's how quickly innovation is progressing. And so, what we need to do is to keep on top of that. So, we cannot always be building only on existing technology platforms. We have to always be one step ahead and say, what is the new technology? And does that then make FDRE type projects much simpler to design and construct because of these new technologies that are coming up?
So particularly the major part of innovations you think will come on the storage side for
Right.
RTC?
I mean, there's continuing innovation on the solar and wind side, right? At least when I say on the wind side, now we've got 5 megawatt turbines that are, I'm going to say, going to become common in India. Uh, Solar, the efficiencies keep improving year after year. There could be, I'd say, fundamental innovations in solar. If the tandem cell concept takes over, which could give I'd say, a fairly significant jump in efficiency. And if those technologies hit the market at a commercially viable price point, right, it could again fundamentally change how we build solar, wind, and battery storage to provide dispatchable energy. Because today you're looking at conventional, and there's still a gap between what renewable can do and what I'd say fully dispatchable thermal can do, right? We haven't fully bridged that gap yet. But these innovations could really take us there. I hope that happens. I fully expect it will happen because that would be the tipping point where you say, I don't need to build thermal again at all, right? And I really look forward to the day when these technologies allow us to reach that point.
Were you excited about offshore wind, and do you think offshore wind could have helped in the growth of RTC renewables? And but we've seen in the past year that the progress that was made over the years, but there was some like cancellation of tenders as well. So, what do you think of this sector, offshore wind?
So, given where we are today on onshore wind, the offshore is going to have a hard time meeting the economics, right? Now, clearly, offshore wind is new to India, but it's not new to the world, right? One just has to go to northern Europe, and you can see offshore wind is, I'd say, everyday generation, right? Uh, it may have a role to play in the future because clearly the wind speeds are higher. However, the capital costs and complexity is much higher as well. So at some point it may happen. The immediate opportunity is how do you maximize the use of onshore wind, which is where this whole sector is focused on. So we'll see if offshore has a role to play in the future. And it's hard to tell.
Okay, I believe that these were all the questions that we had. So thank you very much for the time. This brings us to the end of the episode. Thank you very much for offering such a clear and concise view of where the sector might be headed. It was great having you over.
Thank you. Thanks very much and enjoyed talking to you guys. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Iyer.
Thank you. Bye bye.